Donald Trump's recent public reaction was nothing short of explosive. The moment Mark Carney pushed back and reframed the discussion, Trump's familiar persona, built on control, dominance, and the appearance of always being in command, showed cracks. The outburst was not just about the immediate issue at hand. It was a political performance aimed at reaffirming his authority in front of an audience that thrives on displays of strength. His tone was sharp, his words rapid and confrontational, the type of delivery that signals not just disagreement, but a need to reassert dominance in the room. It was theater, yes, but also a reflection of genuine irritation at being challenged in a way he didn't anticipate. For years, Trump has cultivated an image of being the deal-maker who can always outmaneuver the other side. Here, though Carney's calm, deliberate framing undercut that image, and Trump's response became louder, less controlled, almost defensive in tone. The roots of such a reaction lie in Trump's long, standing approach to negotiations. He often treats policy discussions like real estate deals, high pressure, quick moves, maximum posturing. He has an instinct for detecting weakness in opponents and exploiting it, but when confronted with a counter that doesn't play by his expected script, the reaction can be visceral. Carney's style in this exchange was the opposite of combative, measured, fact-driven, grounded in realities that couldn't be dismissed as mere opinion. This caught Trump in a position where his usual strategies, personal attacks, framing the opponent as incompetent, declaring instant victory, were harder to deploy without looking disconnected from the facts presented. The specific moment when Carney introduced the Potash issue was key. It wasn't framed as a threat, it was framed as a fact of economic interdependence. For Trump, this was a dangerous territory. His political narrative often rests on the idea that the U.S. holds all the major cards in trade disputes, and that allies or rivals ultimately need America more than America needs them. By pointing to a sector in which Canada holds genuine leverage, Carney created a situation where the America First, trade-dominant storyline became harder to defend without acknowledging vulnerability. Vulnerability for Trump is political poison. What made the reaction so intense was that this was not an abstract debate over future policy. It was a moment where the structural realities of resource dependency were put on the table in front of the public. Trump's base, many of whom come from agricultural states, understands the value of fertilizer and the risk of supply disruptions. If Carney's point landed with them, it could reshape how they view trade leverage, potentially weakening Trump's position as the ultimate protector of American economic interests. His sharp escalation in tone and body language reflected not just disagreement, but a rapid, almost instinctive move to shut down a line of argument that could take root in the public consciousness. This was a man defending not just a point in a debate, but the entire narrative framework that sustains his political brand. And the stakes of losing control of that narrative were far higher than the surface level exchange suggested. Mark Carney's response in the confrontation was a masterclass in strategic communication, one that flipped the dynamic of the exchange without raising his voice or resorting to personal attacks. Where Trump relies heavily on volume, repetition, and emotional punch to drive his points, Carney took a slower, steadier path, anchoring his argument in unassailable facts and structural realities that could not be brushed aside as mere opinion. He reframed the debate entirely, shifting it from a personality contest into an examination of material leverage and interdependence between nations. This was not just about making a counterpoint, it was about changing the terms of the conversation in such a way that Trump's usual tactics became less effective. Carney's strength in this moment came from an acute understanding of where real world power lies in a globalized economy, rather than engaging in a tit for tat over tariffs or trade deficits. He highlighted the underlying dependencies that shape those numbers in the first place. By drawing attention to Canada's control over a critical resource like potash, Carney reminded everyone listening that trade is not merely an abstract balance sheet issue. It is about the flow of essential goods, without which economies cannot function. He took the focus away from headline trade disputes and pointed it toward the supply chains that quietly keep entire sectors alive. In doing so, Carney undermined one of Trump's favored narratives that the United States, by virtue of its economic size and military reach, always negotiates from a position of overwhelming strength. Carney's approach revealed that in specific areas, smaller economies can hold leverage that forces even the largest nations to proceed with caution. The fact that this was presented without aggression made it more potent. It suggested confidence born of genuine advantage rather than rhetorical bravado. This kind of confidence is harder to challenge because it does not rely on bluster. It rests on facts that remain true regardless of political spin. The turning of the tables was subtle but effective. While Trump's reaction was emotional, almost theatrical, Carney's measured delivery reinforced the idea that he was speaking from a position of calm authority. The contrast in styles made Trump's agitation more visible, and in the realm of public perception, composure often reads as strength, while visible frustration can be interpreted as weakness. Carney's tactic worked not because it humiliated Trump outright, but because it shifted the center of gravity in the discussion. Suddenly, the question was not about how much the U.S. could pressure Canada, but about how much Canada could influence the U.S. without even raising its voice. By controlling the pace and scope of the conversation, Carney forced observers to think about the deeper mechanics of international power, mechanics that often go unnoticed until they are deliberately pointed out. He demonstrated that economic influence is not solely the domain of the biggest player, and that sometimes the quiet assertion of a specific, irreplaceable advantage can carry more weight than all the aggressive posturing in the world. Potash is not a resource that dominates headlines in the way that oil or natural gas does, yet its importance to the global economy is immense. It is a potassium-rich mineral essential for producing fertilizer, and by extension, it plays a direct role in determining agricultural productivity across the world. Without sufficient potash, crop yields decline sharply, threatening food security on both a national and international scale. It is one of those critical but often invisible inputs, something the average consumer never thinks about when buying groceries, but which determines whether those groceries are abundant and affordable or scarce and expensive. This obscurity is part of what makes it such an effective tool in geopolitical strategy. It is not politically charged in the public consciousness until there is a disruption, at which point its value becomes immediately clear. Canada occupies a unique position in this equation. With some of the largest potash reserves in the world and the status of being the single largest exporter, it holds a degree of influence that extends far beyond its population size or military capabilities. Saskatchewan, in particular, is home to vast underground deposits that have been developed into a sophisticated export-oriented industry. These reserves are not easily replicated elsewhere. The geological conditions required for potash formation are rare, and building the infrastructure to extract and process it takes years, if not decades. This means that Canada's role in the global potash market is not simply a matter of current production, but of long-term structural advantage. From an agricultural standpoint, potash is indispensable. Crops require potassium to grow, and unlike nitrogen, which can be fixed from the air using industrial processes, potassium must be mined from finite deposits. Countries with intensive agricultural industries, such as the United States, China, India, and Brazil, are heavily dependent on imported potash to maintain high yields. This dependency creates a network of relationships in which Canada's decisions on production, pricing, and export policy can have ripple effects across continents. Even small adjustments to output can influence global prices, which in turn affect farming costs, food prices, and ultimately political stability in nations sensitive to food inflation. This strategic importance is amplified in times of broader economic or geopolitical tension. Resource control often becomes a bargaining chip when other forms of negotiation stall. In the same way that oil exporting countries have used production cuts or embargoes to influence political outcomes, a potash-rich country like Canada can subtly leverage its market position to secure favorable terms in unrelated trade disputes. The leverage need not even be exercised overtly. The mere knowledge among policymakers that Canada has this capacity can alter the tone and content of negotiations. What makes potash an even more intriguing case study is its low visibility in popular political debates compared to other commodities. While energy resources are constantly discussed in the context of national security, potash operates under the radar, making it a form of quiet but potent influence. Control over such a resource provides Canada with a form of economic power that is stable, enduring, and not easily challenged by competitors. The agricultural leverage inherent in potash production is both direct and profound. Fertilizer is the lifeblood of modern farming, and potash is one of its indispensable components, supplying potassium to crops in a form they can readily absorb. Without it, the nutritional balance of the soil deteriorates, plants weaken, and yields drop significantly. This is not a gradual decline over decades. It can happen within a single growing season. For countries that rely on large-scale agriculture to feed their populations and sustain export markets, a disruption in potash supply is a serious threat. It is not simply an economic inconvenience. It is a challenge to food security, a sector where instability can rapidly cascade into political unrest. Canada's role as the largest potash exporter gives it an influence that extends deep into the agricultural economies of other nations. Farmers in the U.S. Midwest, the rice paddies of Southeast Asia, and the soybean fields of Brazil all depend on fertilizer blends that require potash to achieve their expected yields. If that input becomes more expensive or harder to obtain, production costs rise, margins shrink, and food prices increase at the consumer level, even minor price changes in fertilizer can lead to noticeable shifts in retail food prices as the costs of production ripple through transportation, processing, and distribution. The sensitivity of this system makes agricultural inputs one of the most strategically significant points of leverage in the global economy. The geopolitical implications are substantial. A country that can influence the cost or availability of potash effectively holds a lever over global food supply chains. While Canada has historically been a reliable and stable supplier, the potential to adjust exports or prices, whether for economic, environmental, or political reasons, is always present. Intense trade negotiations, the knowledge that one side could, if it chose, affect the other's agricultural productivity has a quiet but undeniable impact. Unlike tariffs on manufactured goods, which can be adjusted or sourced from alternative suppliers over time, agricultural inputs have a short window of relevance tied to planting and harvesting cycles. Missing a shipment of potash in spring cannot be fixed in autumn without losing an entire season's production. This time, sensitivity makes potash a far sharper instrument of leverage than it might appear. It also connects directly to voter sentiment in many countries, particularly those with large rural populations dependent on farming. In the United States, for example, agricultural states wield disproportionate influence in national politics through both electoral weight and their role in shaping policy debates. Any disruption to farm inputs can quickly become a political crisis, amplifying the strategic importance of whoever controls the resource in question. The fact that potash is not widely discussed in mainstream political discourse adds to its power as a tool of influence. Because it is not part of the everyday vocabulary of political debate, shifts in its supply can appear sudden and alarming to the public when they occur, giving the controlling country a unique ability to shape events quietly until the moment its leverage is most effective. ChatGPT said, Canada's approach to potash within its broader trade and political strategy is characterized by a balance of stability and quiet leverage. While it does not wield the resource in an overtly aggressive way, its very position as the dominant global supplier creates an underlying influence in negotiations. The country's leadership understands that potash is not just a commodity, but a strategic asset, and this awareness shapes how it interacts with other nations. Unlike oil, which often attracts heavy political scrutiny and public debate, potash remains largely outside the glare of mainstream attention, allowing Canada to maintain a powerful yet low-profile position in the global economy. This makes it an ideal tool for subtle geopolitical maneuvering, where the presence of leverage is felt but rarely acknowledged outright. The structure of Canada's potash industry reinforces this potential. Production is concentrated in a few major companies operating out of Saskatchewan, which allows for coordination and control over output levels without the fragmentation that exists in other resource markets. This centralization means that decisions to adjust production, respond to global price shifts, or manage export volumes can be executed efficiently. In a world where agricultural demand is growing steadily due to population increases and climate-related challenges, such control carries significant weight. Canada does not have to threaten restrictions explicitly. The knowledge that it could adjust supply if relations with a trade partner sour is often enough to influence the tone of discussions. In trade disputes, this influence can be an unspoken part of the negotiating environment. If another country attempts to impose tariffs, restrict Canadian goods, or undermine its market share in other sectors, policymakers in Ottawa know they hold a card that could cause real economic pain to the other side. Agriculture, especially in major economies, is a politically sensitive industry. When costs rise for farmers, the pressure on governments to act quickly becomes intense, and Canada's role in potash supply positions it to be part of that pressure equation. The ability to affect another nation's food production costs without appearing to act aggressively is a rare and valuable form of influence in international politics. This subtlety is key to Canada's strategy. By avoiding public threats or dramatic moves, it maintains its reputation as a reliable and cooperative trade partner while still holding strategic depth. In many cases, the mere fact that such leverage exists allows Canada to secure better terms in broader economic agreements. Potash can function as a silent backdrop to discussions over energy, technology, or even defense cooperation, a form of passive bargaining power that shapes outcomes without dominating headlines. The geopolitical context enhances this role. As global supply chains grow more interconnected, vulnerabilities to specific resource disruptions become more pronounced. Nations are increasingly aware that resilience in critical sectors depends on stable relationships with resource suppliers. Canada's dominance in potash places it in a position where its political voice carries weight beyond its military size or economic volume, demonstrating how over a single critical input can shape the balance of power in ways that are often invisible to the general public. The confrontation between Trump and Carney highlights a fundamental shift in the nature of global power, one that moves beyond scale measures such as military might or sheer economic scale of stratovale and centers, instead on the control of strategic way power. For decades, the dominant narrative in international relations has been that countries with the largest armies, the most advanced weaponry, and the deepest financial reserves wield the greatest influence. Yet, as the world becomes increasingly interconnected, the reality is that control over essential materials, those that sustain everyday life and underpin economic activity, can rival or even surpass conventional forms of power. Potash is a prime example of this emerging dynamic. As a critical ingredient in fertilizer, potash directly impacts agricultural productivity, which in turn influences global food security. Canada's vast reserves and position as the world's largest exporter give it a unique form of economic leverage that operates quietly but effectively. Unlike the more visible power plays involving oil or technology, potash exerts influence in the background, making it harder to counter or even fully appreciate until its effects are felt through rising food prices or disrupted supply chains. Historically, resource control has been a potent instrument in geopolitical strategy. The oil embargo of the 1970s demonstrated how a small group of countries could reshape global politics through coordinated supply restrictions. Similarly, control over rare earth elements today grants certain nations outsized influence in the technology sector. The lesson is clear: resources that are critical, scarce, and difficult to substitute become focal points for power struggles. Carney's invocation of potash placed it squarely in this category, reminding observers that the commodities shaping the future of global stability are not always the ones dominating headlines. For the United States, this reality introduces new vulnerabilities. The narrative of American self sufficiency and dominance is challenged when a critical agricultural input must be imported from a single country with the capacity to influence supply and pricing. This dependency is not merely an economic inconvenience, it has political ramifications. Farmers and rural communities whose livelihoods depend on affordable and reliable fertilizer become sensitive to shifts in potash availability. These sensitivities translate into political pressure on policymakers, demonstrating how resource dependencies can affect domestic governance and international relations alike. The incident also illustrates the growing complexity of global power relations. The United States, often perceived as the uncontested superpower, is increasingly encountering scenarios where smaller, resource rich nations can exert disproportionate influence. This multipolarity complicates traditional power calculations, requiring more nuanced strategies that account for economic interdependence and supply chain vulnerabilities. What makes this shift particularly striking is the subtlety with which resource control operates. Unlike overt military threats or economic sanctions, leveraging a commodity like potash is a quieter form of influence, one that can be deployed selectively, unpredictably, and without the immediate backlash that more aggressive tactics provoke. It is a power that works through patience and timing, leveraging the rhythms of agricultural cycles and market dynamics to create pressure points that are difficult to neutralize. In this light, Canada's position is not merely that of a passive supplier, but of an active participant in shaping the contours of international power. The potash example reveals how control over a single resource can translate into geopolitical weight, challenging assumptions about who holds power in the 21st century and signaling a shift toward a world where economic leverage through strategic materials plays a central role in global affairs